There's this concept that I find particularly interesting. It's the feeling of when you revisit something from your childhood that had a profound effect on you, usually something scary, but with the knowledge and maturity of an adult mind. Sometimes it can manifest as a form of self-embarrassment. How was I ever afraid of that? You might think to yourself. This was made for kids? Could be another phrase, usually for TV programming. I want to tell you about something I rediscovered as an adult, a show that I watched as a child. The official run of it was clean. It was child-friendly, no hidden agendas behind the scripts or characters. Just simple, family-friendly programming. That nostalgic concept I started with, it does apply here. Discovering what happened behind closed doors while I was a child. Don't misconstrue what I'm trying to get across here. The tragedies I'm going to detail are completely removed from myself. I was never involved in any kind of sadistic or sick events as a young boy. I had a good childhood. Worst that ever happened to me was a broken arm from our trampoline. But while I was enjoying my life, having friends stay over for slumber parties, having Nerf battles in the backyard, running around the property with our dogs, someone's life was falling apart. Is it my responsibility to feel guilty for having a good life while someone else was suffering? No, of course not. But it's my adult perception that makes me wish I could have done something, told someone older than me at the time. Maybe they could have done something. Probably not. In the days I've had to think about this, I wonder if he could have ever recovered, come back to the world, and be happy again. As a kid, I never would have understood the tragedy. Perhaps it's a good thing I found out about it as an adult, to allow me to appreciate the terrible events that took place with the full depth of a matured mind. The name of the show was as generic as one could get for a semi-local broadcasting: The Fun Family. From a title like that, you probably think it was some low-budget show run by a strange person with no aptitude for entertainment. You would be wrong. Despite its low budget, this 5-member family was incredibly talented. Everything was homemade, but you'd barely be able to tell. All the cartoonish items, backgrounds, and stages were crafted in such a way that, despite being obviously made by the family themselves, looked like they belonged on a major network TV channel. They could act worth a damn, and they were all very competent singers, never out of tune, unless intentionally, and the music sounded like it was produced right out of Hollywood. These people deserved so much more fame than they had already achieved. There was even puppet work. They had a ceiling-mounted machine that they hooked up full puppets to and programmed movements into the machine, allowing the puppets to move in a semi-autonomous fashion. All you had to do, as an actor, was memorize the scene, and you could have a fairly engaging skit with the wire work going on. I can, thankfully, say that there were no darker things going on during the original production of the show. No abuse of the actors, no secret drug addictions or strange sexual habits. The only problem that they encountered on their 8th year of production were the obvious health issues Fun Man himself, the dad, was having. He remained in his reading chair during episodes more than usual. Behind-the-scenes coverage for the show is not abundant, but it does exist. It seemed that Funman had suffered some kind of knee injury in between seasons, which restricted his walking. Like I said, nothing dark and disturbing. They worked around this, having the dad now become more of a old, wise storyteller character than one of the superactive members. He would summarize skits that had just finished and would segue the viewer into the next part of the show. One might think that this was him trying to hold on to being an active member, but he seemed to take his new, reduced role with pride. He still had his active moments, singing and limited dancing. I remember as a kid seeing him as a grandpa-like figure, despite him being nearly the same age as my own father. The mom, Fun Mom, a very creative name, I know, looked like she came right out of a 50s American illustration. In fact, that was the feel of the whole family. She was always wearing a dress with hair neatly kept, a light coating of makeup, but never overpowering. She had a voice to match. It sounded no different than the female singers of the era she looked like she was dressed from. The 3 kids they had, all in their early to late teens. Funny Danny was the oldest of the 3, most likely 17. He was nearly a spitting image of his dad. In later seasons, when Fun Man wasn't giving a moral lesson or punchline for the skit, it was Funny Danny. Most likely getting us, the audience, used to seeing him in the main role, once his dad was no longer able to reasonably participate in the show. He was also one of the main prop designers in the show. A few episodes even had him making a new puppet or fixing up set pieces. Funny Sally, the middle child, most likely 14 or 15. She and her mom dressed very similarly. Though Sally had blonde hair instead of brown, she took after her dad in that regard. She and her mother would harmonize with each other on countless musical numbers. She also had great comedic timing, like Danny and her father. Lastly, Funny Jimmy. I'm sure you've noticed the naming pattern. He was the youngest of the 3, something like 11 or 12. He was usually there to ask questions about things, a stand-in for the young audience watching at home. He, Danny, and Fun Man would do a fairly decent barbershop quartet once in a while. The show was mostly about having fun and enjoying life. Lots of upbeat musical numbers. Everyone enjoyed this job of theirs, and us, the viewers, were right there with them. Despite this obviously being a showbiz family, they took time off for themselves to get away from the cameras. There was usually a good 4 to 6 month gap between seasons, giving them time to unwind from their screen lives. If you're waiting for a sudden change in tone, for a damning piece of information, it's not here. The show ended on its 12th season. They felt they had done everything they wanted to do with the show, and left while they were on top. They did some short tours and convention appearances. In person, it was reported that they were down to earth, had a good sense of humor that went a bit beyond their hardline G-rated show, and overall, were what the world needed more of. When I talk about tragedy, this is what I mean. While nothing sinister happened during the run of the show, nor during their live appearances, it would be the car crash that gave way to something horrific. June 2nd, 1994. Everyone but Danny was in their family car when a head-on collision with a semi-truck during a heavy blizzard left him the only member alive, back at home. He most likely would have been in his early 20s at this point. The money from the show made sure he would be able to live, at least financially, comfortable for decades to come. Of course, money doesn't bring your family back to life. There was an outpour of sympathy from fans all over the place. a genuine heartbreak. For many, it was like they had lost their own family too. Danny didn't play tough. He didn't hide his emotions. Though thankfully, he didn't use this as a chance to get back in the spotlight. He tearfully thanked his fans for their support and assured them that he would be all right. It would take time, but he would make it through this tribulation. If you know this show and have the same fond memories that I used to, you are more than welcome to stop here. I urge you to enjoy the ignorance that I no longer possess. But you won't. You're like me. You want to know. Our curious nature is oftentimes a curse. I remember a few days ago watching some of the older episodes, bathing in the nostalgia, appreciating the quality the series had, and how it held up to even today's standards. I would have gladly shown this to my own future children, whenever that may happen. But now, I can't watch it again. I can't look at Danny anymore, knowing just how much pain he would suffer at his own hands. He was happy once. You could see it in his eyes. He was so full of life. Now it just reminds me of how badly someone can tear themselves apart. I found some old forum posts on the internet. I couldn't tell you where or which ones. I spent hours going from one thread to another, clicking on link after link. Most of it was about people's experience with the show, or them having seen the live performances. It was the posts from a few people who had more direct contact with Danny after the crash that really got people's attention. Of course, all of these threads have been silent since the early 2000s, and I want to keep it that way. No need for all of you to have your memories ruined. Danny had secluded himself from the outside world after what had happened. His documented public appearances, the last ones that anyone got. Those who had direct correspondence with him barely got communications with him afterwards. One person got a message from him before he went dark. Working on one last episode, want to give the family a good send-off, was what Danny had told this person. That was apparently only about a month after the crash. Of course, as you know, if you're familiar with this series, there was no new episode of The Happy Family. Not a public one, anyways. After about 3 hours, dozens of forums later, a secluded website that barely had any traffic, given that the thread that had the link barely had any activity, I found this unpublished episode. It's interesting to me that this data from over 20 years ago is just sitting on some hard drive, in some server unit, in some building, most likely having originated from someone's personal computer, then transferred to an offsite storage area. Information moved in batches from one server farm to another. Only a handful of people know it's there. Certainly not the people who maintain the digital infrastructure. This footage, once on an analog medium, sits as a collection of ones and zeros. A man's self-destruction, preserved perpetually. You could tell there was no one manning the cameras due to the fact that Danny stayed in center frame, careful to not move out of focus, since no one could follow or adjust for his movements. There was music in the scene, though it was coming from an off-screen source, rather than being placed in the video after the fact. You could hear the reverberation of the sound and the lower quality, given that it was most likely coming from a stereo or boombox. As a one-man show, the cracks in production were easily visible. This time, it did resemble some cheap public access show you might be thinking of. While his acting and singing were still high quality, there was this emptiness to it, as if he was just going through the motions, rather than actual, genuine enjoyment. It was about 10 minutes into this lackluster production that the tone shifted in Danny. He still tried to maintain his well-known upbeat attitude, but there was a language in his eyes, one that spoke of fear. He was constantly looking behind himself as he segued us into the puppet show. I can only imagine what was going through his mind while he prepared the last episode. For months on end. I imagine that he fooled himself into thinking it was some kind of proper send-off. But when the time actually came for it to happen, his nerves, his good intentions, began to waver. From behind Danny, 4 life-sized wooden puppets descended from top frame. It didn't take long at all to figure out who they were supposed to look like. Danny's craftsmanship was on point, and it only worsened his state. These puppets looked nearly identical to their late, real-life counterparts. Fun Man, Fun Mom, Funny Sally, Funny Jimmy. A voice rang out from the off-screen sound system. It was the voice of Fun Man, or at least Danny's best impression of him. The voice announced that it was time for a family dance number. All the other voices agreed in unison, Danny trying to mimic their personalities as well. He got in position behind his wooden family, began to dance along with their pre-programmed movements. This was, by far, the hardest part of the show. The part that hurt the most. Danny was falling apart on screen. The music, upbeat like normal, while this man pretended to have his family with him, dancing, happy. I think the reality of what he was doing hit the hardest once the routine began. This wasn't his family. This wasn't the show. This was him trying to hold on to whatever semblance of a normal life he used to have. I could see it in his eyes. He was losing himself. Tears streamed down his face, ever smiling, though. When one of their false voices would talk to him, his response was broken, barely composed. Every ounce of control Danny had over his dancing and singing was being strained against the breakdown he was experiencing. I watched a man lose himself. I watched a man so desperate to hold on to the life he had, the people he loved, that he rebuilt them. He wired them up. He gave them his voice, and he made them dance. Just for one last moment of normalcy. Danny lost his motivation before the number was over. He had reached his end. As the puppets continued to flail around in an increasingly haphazard motion, the upbeat, chipper music accenting the scene, Danny stood there, his face blank. I watched a man come back to his senses and die on screen. Any light left in his eyes was gone. He walked up to the camera and turned it off. I sat there for some time at my desk, going over what I saw in my head. Of course, the obvious reaction would be that of being disturbed by the puppet versions of his family. How much work obviously went into them. How long it must have taken Danny to build them. I wonder how many times in that darkness that he had second thoughts about putting on that last performance. Perhaps he truly convinced himself that it was the send-off he thought it would be. How nervous he became only moments before the puppets descended tells me that he didn't fully accept the weight of what he was about to do, not until the moment was upon him. That's not what hit me the hardest. It was the self-destruction of this man that cut the deepest. A man so full of life, who enjoyed his job, his family, and had a good future waiting for him. All of that crumbling down on a soundstage, desperate for a life he could never get back. A police report claims that the scene was discovered a day or two later. Dried blood splattered against it behind his head. A pistol in his right hand. I speculate that the police took the tape as evidence. Then at some point, while digitizing footage they had of dozens to hundreds of other cases, transferred this media as well. At some point, most likely, the precinct shut down. All the data was transferred to other places. Someone gets their hand on it, wants to preserve it. This is not the story of a children's TV show that turned out to have dark and sinister intentions. It's not about me realizing my childhood had disturbing moments in it that I repressed. This is about a man who tore himself apart, trying to be happy again.